The first light of dawn broke over the frozen prairie, painting the snow-capped mountains in shades of gold and amber that seemed almost cruel in their beauty. It was a beauty that belonged to a world untouched by human suffering, indifferent to the struggles of those who tried to survive in its shadow. Elizabeth Harper barely noticed it. She sat with her back against the massive wooden wheel of her broken wagon, her body numb from cold and exhaustion, her arms wrapped protectively around her two sleeping children. Thomas was 6, his dark hair falling across his peaceful face as he slept curled against his mother's side. Little Anna was only 4, her small hand clutching the edge of the worn blanket that barely kept the three of them warm. They had finally stopped shivering an hour ago, which terrified Elizabeth more than their earlier complaints of cold. She knew what it meant when the body stopped fighting the freeze. She held them tighter, her own body a shield against the bitter wind that swept across the open plain. The wagon wheel behind her back was more than just shelter from the wind. It was a monument to her failure, a symbol of dreams that had shattered as completely as the axle that had snapped 2 days ago. Her husband, James, had died 6 months earlier from pneumonia, leaving Elizabeth with 2 small children, a mountain of debt, and a wagon full of hope that they could make it to Oregon where her sister lived. The journey had been harder than she'd imagined, each day bringing new challenges that she faced alone. Then the axle broke. The wagon lurched sideways, spilling half their supplies across the frozen ground. Elizabeth had tried everything she could think of to fix it, but she lacked the tools, the knowledge, and the strength. For 2 days, she'd waited by the side of the trail, hoping another wagon train would pass. But this late in the season, most sensible travelers had already made their journeys or decided to wait until spring. She had seen only one rider in the distance yesterday, but he had been too far away to signal. Last night, as the temperature dropped and the children cried from hunger and cold, Elizabeth had made peace with the possibility that they might not survive. She had prayed, begged God for a miracle, and then simply held her children close, singing them the lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. Now, as the sun rose on what might be their last day, she felt oddly calm. If this was the end, at least they would be together. The sound of hoofbeats broke through her exhausted thoughts. Elizabeth's head snapped up, her heart suddenly racing. A rider was approaching from the west, moving at a steady pace across the frozen plain. As he drew closer, she could make out details. A tall man on a magnificent chestnut horse, dressed in expensive-looking riding clothes that spoke of wealth. A broad-brimmed hat shaded his face, but even from a distance, she could sense the confidence in the way he sat his horse. Elizabeth tried to stand, to wave, to call out, but her legs refused to cooperate. She had been sitting in the cold too long, and her body was shutting down. She managed only a weak gesture with one arm before exhaustion pulled it back down. But it was enough. The rider had seen them. He spurred his horse forward, closing the distance quickly, and as he drew near, Elizabeth could see the shock register on his weathered face. He was perhaps 40 years old, with steel-gray eyes that took in the scene with swift assessment. The broken wagon, the scattered supplies, the frost-covered woman and children huddled against the wheel. "Dear God," he said, swinging down from his horse with practiced ease. "How long have you been out here?" 2 days, Elizabeth managed, her voice barely a whisper. "The wagon, it broke. My children, please, help my children." The man moved with swift efficiency. He knelt beside them, checking the children first with gentle hands that spoke of experience. "They're alive," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Cold, but alive. We need to warm them up slowly." He shed his heavy coat and wrapped it around all 3 of them, then pulled a flask from his saddlebag. "Take a small sip," he instructed Elizabeth. "Just a little. It'll help warm you from the inside." The whiskey burned her throat, but it sent a thread of warmth through her chest. "My children," she repeated. "I know," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you need to be strong enough to hold them. Drink." He made her take another sip, then capped the flask and stood. "My ranch is 2 hours' ride from here. I'm going to put the 3 of you on my horse and lead you there. Can you hold on to your children if I lift you up?" Elizabeth nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. But the man seemed to take her at her word. With surprising gentleness for someone so large and rough-looking, he lifted Anna first, then Thomas, placing them carefully in their mother's arms. Then he lifted all three of them together onto his horse, steadying them with strong hands. "What's your name?" he asked as he took the horse's reins and began leading them eastward. "Elizabeth Harper," she said. "Mrs. Elizabeth Harper. These are my children, Thomas and Anna." "I'm Daniel Thornton," the man replied. "I own the Thornton Ranch about 10 miles east of here. You're lucky I came this way. I was checking on some winter grazing land. Another hour and—" He trailed off, leaving the grim thought unfinished. The ride to the ranch seemed to take forever and no time at all. Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of the horse's walk and the warmth of her children in her arms. When they finally arrived, she had a vague impression of a large house, several outbuildings, and people rushing forward at Thornton's shouted commands. What followed was a blur of activity. Elizabeth and her children were carried into the warm house, where a housekeeper named Mrs. Chen took charge with brisk efficiency. They were stripped of their frozen clothes, wrapped in warm blankets, and given hot broth to drink in tiny sips. A doctor was sent for, arriving within an hour to examine all three of them. His verdict was cautiously optimistic. They would recover, but they had been perilously close to freezing to death. Elizabeth woke the next morning in a real bed for the first time in months, her children sleeping peacefully in a smaller bed across the room. Sunlight streamed through curtains, and she could smell coffee and bacon cooking somewhere in the house. For a moment, she thought she might be dreaming. Then the door opened softly, and Daniel Thornton entered, carrying a tray with breakfast. "You're awake," he said, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Good. Doctor said you'd pull through fine, but it's good to see your eyes clear. Your children woke up an hour ago. Mrs. Chen is feeding them in the kitchen. They're already running around like nothing happened. Kids are resilient." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved our lives. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Thornton set the tray down and pulled up a chair beside the bed. "You don't owe me anything," he said simply. "But I do need to understand your situation. Where were you headed? Where's your husband?" Elizabeth told him everything. About James's death, about the debts that had forced her to sell their small farm, about her decision to head west to Oregon where her sister had promised them a place to stay, about the journey that had been harder than she'd imagined, the supplies that had run low, and finally the broken wagon that had stranded them. Thornton listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Oregon is still 2 months' journey from here, and winter is setting in hard. Even with a working wagon, you'd never make it through the mountain passes before spring. And I don't mean any disrespect, Mrs. Harper, but you don't have the supplies or the strength to attempt it." "I know," Elizabeth said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. But what choice do I have? I have no money, no home, nowhere to go. My sister in Oregon is my only family left." "You have a choice now," Thornton said slowly, as if working through an idea as he spoke. "You can stay here. I have a proposition for you, if you'll hear it." Elizabeth looked at him warily, afraid of what he might suggest. She had heard stories of what desperate women sometimes had to do to survive, and while she was grateful to Thornton for saving them, she wouldn't compromise her dignity or her children's safety. Thornton must have seen the fear in her eyes because he held up his hands quickly. "Nothing improper, I assure you. I'm offering you honest work and a home. You see, Mrs. Harper, I built this ranch 20 years ago with my late wife, Catherine. She died 3 years ago, and since then, this place has just been a house, not a home. It's clean and functional, thanks to Mrs. Chen, but it's empty, cold, despite the fires." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over his land. "I'm a wealthy man, Mrs. Harper. The ranch has prospered beyond anything Catherine and I dreamed of. But I've learned that wealth without family, without purpose beyond profit, is hollow. I don't need a housekeeper. I have Mrs. Chen. I don't need someone to cook or clean. What I need is life in this house again. Children's laughter. A family, even if it's not bound by blood." He turned back to face her. "I'm proposing this. I'll build you and your children a home on my property. A real home, not a cabin or a room in the main house. but a proper house of your own. You'll have complete independence, your own space. In exchange, you and your children would be part of the ranch community. You'd take meals with me when you're comfortable doing so, help me remember what it's like to have family around. The children could go to school in town, which is only 5 miles away. You'd have security, safety, and a future. Elizabeth stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. You would build us a house? Just like that? Why would you do such a thing for strangers? Because I can, Thornton said simply. Because I have more money than I could spend in 2 lifetimes, and what good is it doing anyone sitting in a bank? Because yesterday morning, I woke up in this big house and realized I hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 days except to give orders to ranch hands. Because when I saw you sitting against that wagon wheel, protecting your children with your own body even when you were freezing to death yourself, I saw the kind of courage and love that makes life worth living. He paused, then added quietly, and because 20 years ago, Catherine and I were traveling west to start this ranch when our wagon broke down in the middle of nowhere. A stranger helped us, gave us shelter, helped me repair the wagon, and refused any payment. He said, "Pass it on when you can." Well, Mrs. Harper, I can. And I'd like to. Elizabeth couldn't speak through her tears. It was too much, too generous, too incredible to believe. But looking into Daniel Thornton's steady gray eyes, she saw only sincerity and kindness. Over the following weeks, as Elizabeth and her children recovered their strength, they watched in amazement as Thornton kept his word. He hired carpenters from town and set them to work building a small but beautiful house on a rise overlooking a creek, about a 1/4 mile from the main ranch house. Close enough to be part of the community, far enough to offer privacy and independence. He involved Elizabeth in every decision, asking her preferences about layout, colors, and details. He built it with 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen with a modern stove, a sitting room with a fireplace, and a covered porch that faced the mountains. He filled it with furniture, supplied a pantry with food, and even had a small barn built nearby for a milk cow and some chickens. When spring came, the house was finished. On the day Elizabeth and her children moved in, Thornton gathered his ranch hands and threw a celebration. There was music, food, and genuine warmth from the ranch community who had taken the widow and her children under their collective wing. As the sun set and the party wound down, Elizabeth found Thornton standing on her new porch, looking out over the land. She joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I still don't understand why you did this," she said softly. "It's too much. No one does something like this without wanting something in return." Thornton took the coffee and smiled. "You're wrong about that. Some people do. Not enough, maybe, but some. As for what I get in return..." He gestured toward the yard where Thomas and Anna were playing with some of the ranch hands' children, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "I get to hear that every day. I get to have Sunday dinners that feel like family again. I get to watch your children grow up safe and happy. I get to know that the wealth I've accumulated actually means something beyond numbers in a ledger." He turned to face her directly. "Mrs. Harper, when my Catherine died, I thought my life was over. I went through the motions, built the ranch even bigger, made more money, but none of it mattered. Finding you and your children out there that morning, it gave me purpose again. It reminded me that the point of success isn't to hoard it, it's to use it to make the world a little bit better, one family at a time." Elizabeth set down her coffee and, acting on impulse, hugged him. It was brief and respectful, but genuine. "You're a good man, Daniel Thornton. The world needs more people like you." Years passed. Thomas grew into a strong young man who learned ranching from Thornton and eventually became his right-hand man in running the operation. Anna became a teacher in the town school, known for her kindness to struggling students. Elizabeth found her own purpose, helping other families who passed through the area, offering shelter and assistance to those in need, passing on the generosity that had saved her life. Thornton never remarried, but he was never alone. Elizabeth's family became his family, and the ranch became a place known throughout the territory for its generosity. When travelers found themselves in trouble, people would tell them, "Get to the Thornton Ranch. Daniel will help." On his deathbed, many years later, surrounded by Elizabeth, her children, and their children, Thornton reflected on his life. "I was a millionaire when I found you by that wagon," he said to Elizabeth, his voice weak but content. "But that day, when I decided to help instead of riding past, that's when I became truly wealthy. Thank you for letting me be part of your family." Elizabeth held his hand and smiled through her tears. "Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for showing us that there is still goodness in the world." The story of the millionaire cowboy who built a home for a freezing widow and her children became legend in that part of the territory. It was told around campfires and dinner tables, in churches and schools, as an example of what one person could do when they chose compassion over indifference, generosity over greed. And on a rise overlooking a creek, the house still stood, lived in by Elizabeth's descendants, a testament to the day a wealthy rancher chose to pass on a kindness, and in doing so, built something far more valuable than any mansion. He built a home where love dwelt, where strangers became family, and where the true meaning of wealth was measured not in dollars but in lives transformed by simple human kindness.